I think about that portrait, that photo, it occurs to me that it just really captures me. Captures me in the place where I do my work and what I do and how I feel about being here on the ranch. In this place where there's so much beautiful land, pretty much natural land, Florida land, so much wildlife, so many caracaras. Using my binoculars to find nests and see the birds and watch that wide open space, it really captured, I think, my feelings about being here, about this place. And I think to people, place is really important, and how you feel about where you are and whether your soul fits there. And I feel like my soul and myself really fits in this place.
Did you ever have any other pictures like that in the past? A photographer like posing you or doing that kind of thing?
No, I've never had a portrait like that. I'm not particularly photogenic, I don't think. Or to have anybody try to capture me as I think I really am and as I feel as about what I do. And we did a lot of shots when I was doing my graduate work in the 90s. There were some newspaper articles. IFAS from University of Florida came down one time and did some video and did some photographs for their research magazine. We had some things in local newspapers. We did an article in the Florida Cattlemen's Association monthly magazine, things like that. But they were sort of just documentation photos of what we were doing, not so much to really capture who I am and what I'm doing and why I'm here. Oh, it's a long story of why I'm here even in the first place. I remember the day that I learned that there was an opening at the graduate school in the University of Florida Wildlife Ecology Department for somebody to study the caracara on this new ranch that had become available at Archbold. The MacArthur Family Foundation owned it at the time, and there was an agreement between the University of Florida and Archbold and the MacArthur Foundation to open up this ranch for long-term ecological research. And so there were some funds for somebody to study some wildlife, some funds for somebody to start some plant work. And so myself and a former colleague of mine, another colleague who's studying amphibians, we came down here to live on the ranch, and I was going to look at caracaras. And at the time that came open, I didn't really know what a caracara was, and I still remember the day I looked at the field guide and said, that's the bird, that's what I'm going to do. And I was amazed because I'd never seen one, and I didn't really know what it was or where it was. And I thought it was pretty cool. So we came down here and did a scoping trip, drove around, and at the time it was flood season, and the water was up to the wheel wells of the truck, and we're driving around, and I'm thinking, oh boy, this is going to be a real challenge. But I love challenges, so I decided to go for it. And came down here first, I believe, in the summer of 1992, and was going to try to figure out what to do, basically. And driving around looking for birds. Initially, I wanted to study behavior, but I found that it was pretty difficult to find the birds and figure out what I was going to do for behavior. So we decided ultimately we really needed to focus on nesting behavior, because really nobody knew anything about these birds when I got here. Nobody had ever studied them. They'd been listed as threatened federally and by the state of Florida in 1987, based on what I would consider a very poor data set, mostly just observations that were not systematic, that were not continuous, just opportunistic basically. So nobody really knew anything about this bird. And I found that curious in the long run, because ultimately they were pretty easy to study, except for the fact that many of them live on private land. And so what I ended up doing a lot was developing relationships and cultivating cooperation with local landowners, which at the time in the 90s was not overly difficult. There were a lot of original Floridians living here still, a lot of the families that had been here a long time, and they were very eager to sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about the land and their lives and being here in Florida and what they used to see for wildlife and what now they didn't see much anymore. And sure, they thought caracaras were cool, and yeah, I could go on their land and look for nests and things. And so I did that. And we ended up learning how to find nests pretty easily, and found quite a few, and decided to focus on simply understanding their breeding biology, which really nobody knew anything about. And so, having done some raptor work in the past, I figured that the caracaras would have a relatively defined nesting season. And since my husband at the time was still living in New Mexico, I could be here in Florida for a month or two, do the nesting work, and then go back to New Mexico. Well, that didn't happen because it turned out the caracaras nest almost all year round. We had nests all the way from September through April and May, and the peak being in January, but it was a very long, spread out nesting season. And I think partly because of the relatively temperate climate, because of the availability of food everywhere, particularly on the ranches. So I ended up living here on the ranch and doing the work for 3.5 years, pretty much year round. And so we focused on the nests. We got information about clutch size and brood size and timing and some behavior of the parents and the whole 9 yards, and published a few papers based on that. But we also wanted to know something about use of space and how the territories were spread around the landscape, and home range size, the kinds of things that people always ask. How many birds are there and how much area do they need, basically. And the agencies particularly needed that information about area because they were trying to understand how to develop buffers around nesting sites so that they could be protected from land conversion or development or activity that might upset the nesting success of the birds. So we had to capture birds to do that. We had to capture adults to affix them with, at the time, VHF transmitters that would provide locations that we could get to eventually develop a home range. And so to do that, I had to learn how to catch the caracaras. And so, having done some raptor work in the past, I tried all the traditional methods that work pretty well with raptors. Bauscha trees, little cages with nooses that catch their feet, noose carpets, flat wires that catch their feet, snares that catch feet if you put it near bait. I remember somebody asked me one time, well, why don't you just put a snare on a fence post and catch it that way? And I looked around the ranch and I said, okay, you tell me which fence post to put this snare on. There's thousands of fence posts here, and you can't predict what fence post any bird's going to sit on at any one time. But anyway, none of those methods worked. Nothing worked. And so I came pretty close to actually giving up because I thought, I'm never going to get this information. I can't catch these birds. But I had, at the time, a mounted bird, a taxidermy mount from the University of Florida Museum that was really pretty nice, and they let me borrow it. So I thought, well, let's just take it out around and put it by some nests and see what happens. And so I'll never forget the day we figured this out. We had found a couple nests at that point, the first 2 or 3 that we found. And I took this mount out into the middle of a pasture and just set it down kind of near the nest. Because I thought, well, maybe, there's some territorial behavior or something. And there was a caracara flying around at the time. It was chasing a bald eagle. And the caracara literally did a double take. It went like this and looked at that mount and just turned and came down and knocked it over. And I thought, that's it. Now I know what we need to do to catch these birds. And so we got a hold of a pretty large bow net. You have to have a large one because they do fly pretty fast and can turn pretty quickly for such a large raptor. They're not like eagles that are slow to get off the ground. And got a hold of this bow net and set it up with the mount inside. And the mount itself actually didn't work. The birds figured out pretty quickly that it wasn't alive. And so that didn't work very well. And we had the usual misfires of the net. A couple times the net would get caught and it would fire halfway and I'd miss the bird and things like that. But we eventually learned how to do it. And it turned out that we could use a live caracara as a lure to bring in the wild birds that would result in the capture. That they really ultimately don't like other adult caracaras in their nesting territory, particularly really near a nest. And that was what we used to capture them. And it worked really well. So I've caught now probably more than 100 adults that way, and affixed them with transmitters and followed them to get home range information. Back in the day, we had to fly. We flew in a small airplane with radio antennas attached to the wing struts, and did a lot of groundwork with the old waving around the Yagi antenna to get the locations. But we were able to get some of that basic information. And so that ended up being quite successful in terms of what we learned about the nesting biology and the area used by the birds. So over the years, satellite telemetry was being used to track migrant birds, particularly migrant raptors, particularly big ones, because initially those units were fairly big, and their accuracy was not very good. It was great for a migrant raptor if you wanted to know if they went from North America to South America, but for a caracara, which is basically sedentary, does not migrate here in Florida, and never leaves their home range, the accuracy wasn't good enough. And so we didn't use any transmitters for quite some time because the VHF became too difficult with the flights, and I was off on an academic job at that point. But about 2014, the satellite units started to get smaller and more accurate, and then also became the development of GPS GSM units, which now communicate with the cellular network. They collect actual GPS coordinates. When the military took the GPS system off secrecy and off their only ability to use it, now made it publicly available, all of a sudden people could use GPS for all kinds of things. And so the transmitters became developed, and we tested some of them in 2014. There were several companies that were doing them at the time. We tested them all. And we also tested some satellite transmitters that had become small enough, but it turned out, we learned in 2012, that the caracaras really didn't tolerate those transmitters. They had an upright vertical antenna coming out of the back that really bothered the birds for some reason. We don't really know why. But it turned out that they took the units off and got pretty upset about having those transmitters attached. So we stopped using them. The Fish and Wildlife Service agreed that they're no longer to be used. And luckily, the GPS GSM transmitters got good enough that we were able to use those. And they have internal antennas. There's no external antenna at all. They have little solar panels, so their battery is continually charged by solar energy. And so they became really the way to go as far as now tracking birds for much longer periods and getting many, many more data points. So the project we're working on now, or multiple projects actually, the caracaras in Florida, it's an isolated population, and some recent genetic work that has just come out suggests that they may even, the population here may even qualify for subspecies distinction. Which is new information. The genetic work has recently been completed. And so that means there's no birds coming in from anywhere, and there's no birds leaving to go to another population. There's never been a banding record of any of my banded birds outside of Florida, and I've banded hundreds of caracaras. None of them have ever been found outside of Florida. None of my birds anyway. So the population is isolated, and I like it to liken it to a fish bowl with a lot of fish in it. And the fish bowl is getting smaller and smaller, but the number of fish is staying the same or even getting higher. And so pretty soon you have a population living in a situation where the suitable habitat has become so limited that either the pairs can't reproduce anymore successfully, or they simply die and there's no turnover, and the population at that point can decline very rapidly to even extinction. And in this part of Florida, there's so much development going on, so much land conversion. First it was to citrus, which it turns out the caracaras are okay with citrus. They do use it for various reasons. But now conversion to sugarcane, which is really useless as any kind of a breeding habitat. Sugarcane can be temporarily a good foraging habitat after the cane is burned, but for the most part it's not usable for caracaras at all. Housing developments, large water retention areas that cover up acres and acres of land with deep water. So the bottom line is much of the caracaras habitat in Florida is still disappearing, and there's no new habitat being created really, and the population is isolated. So that still, to me, suggests a situation for at least threatened status, meaning that if that trajectory continues of habitat loss, then the population could really suffer severe decline. So what we're working on now is trying to understand what happens to birds when their nesting tree or the parts of their territory are converted from appropriate suitable habitat to unusable habitat, whether it's urban development or agriculture or deep water. Where do those birds go? They could, you gotta clear my throat, you can edit that out. Where do those birds go? They could move, find another territory, set up a nest site, successfully continue to breed. But if the habitat is already pretty full, that might be tough. They may have to push a few neighbors around to be able to squeeze in a new territory. Or they might try to do that and not be successful. They might find a place where they can reside, but they don't reproduce successfully anymore because their territory is too small, or they fight with the neighbors or whatever. Or if they really are upset by the land conversion, they could split up as a pair and just wander for the rest of their lives, never reproducing again or finding a territory, or even just dying without ever successfully reproducing again. So there are several possibilities that could occur when a nesting pair is upset by removal or conversion of their nesting habitat. So we're trying to understand which of those possibilities might happen in various project situations. And so that means catching the adults at those nests on the projects that are going to be affected, and putting these new GPS, GSM transmitters on them to understand what their habitat use is before the project converts their territory, and then after that conversion happens, what happens to the individuals. And so that's really going pretty well, although it's slow because the projects are coming on sort of one at a time. So yes, we have about a half a dozen birds now that are on projects where the land is being converted. And on one project, the conversion has already happened, and we've been able to document the shift in the nest site location of that pair several times, and also the shift in the home range area of that pair, and what we think might even be that pair pushing a pair that was farther north to them even farther north, such that we can't find their nest anymore because they've been pushed so far to the north that that pair, second pair of the nest site, we can't seem to find anymore. So it may be on private land that we can't access. But the thing about the GPS, GSM transmitters that's so great is that you can program them to collect locations at your desire. For example, you could get 3 locations a day, or 10 locations a day, or locations every half hour if you really wanted that kind of detail. We usually get 6 to 8 locations a day because we want the batteries on the transmitters to last a long time. But over a period of even a year, you can get thousands and thousands of data points, which is fabulous when you're trying to understand spatial use by those birds, and particularly places that they favor for roost sites, or particular places that they favor for foraging sites. And we're learning that by having this much data available from those transmitters. So catching the adult caracaras now, we really have it figured out, and we have a pretty foolproof method that we use that involves now a taxidermy mount. We're going back to using that again, which is really more appropriate, and bait. And what happens is that about a week before we want to trap at a particular site, we set up what we call a dummy trap, which is 2 parallel poles that sort of mimic the poles that eventually will be the real trap, and an old fishing net that we use that will mimic the eventual net that we will actually use. And then we set bait inside that footprint, kind of a 1/2 inch footprint. And every other day we set all this nice new bait for them. And we do it near the nest, and the nest at that time we do it contains fairly old chicks. We like to wait until the chicks are 4 or 5 weeks old before we start this trapping process, just to be sure that the chicks are old enough that the parents are fully invested and they won't have thermoregulation problems or be subject to predation like they are when they're really small. So we wait till the chicks are older, and we set up this dummy trap and bait it every other day for about a week, so the parents are used to coming to that site for food. And at that point, they're really interested in feeding their chicks all the time. They're desperate looking for food, and so they like to see this bait, and they come to the bait. So then on the actual trapping day, or the day before, we go out and set up the actual trap, test the net, make sure everything works fine, decide where I'm going to sit in the blind, and then we don't put any bait on that day before. We take all the other old bait and everything away. And then the actual day of the trap, we come in very early, put in fresh bait, put up the actual net, test it, make sure it works, put the taxidermy mount there. I'm hiding in the blind with the tripwire, and we find that with bait, the adults do respond to that taxidermy mount. They didn't do it if bait wasn't there, but with bait there and they're used to coming to that bait, all of a sudden this intruder, caracara, shows up at their bait, and they don't like that. So they come in, they walk up to the bait, and in some cases have actually knocked over the taxidermy mount, and then start to feed on the bait, and they're easily captured. So that works quite well, and we now have the process down to where we know that we can pretty much capture every bird we need to. Retirement's actually pretty nice because I get to do more of what I really enjoy doing, which is this field work and being involved in this whole context here in Florida of understanding this population and its response to human activities and increasing human population, increasing human land use conversion. So I hope that I can continue to be involved in those projects for several more years, including trapping of the birds and tagging and managing the data to understand their spatial use and what happens over time to those pairs when their territory gets converted. So I hope I can stay involved for at least a little while longer. Yeah, so another one of my retirement projects has been starting to learn something about the Arizona population of caracaras. We don't have caracaras in New Mexico. There's quite a large population in Texas, but there's so many of them that people almost consider them as pests, and really nobody's too interested in studying them at this point. But in Arizona, the population is not large, and it lives in a fairly restricted area in the southern part of the state near Tucson. And so there was a lot of interest there in that population because in the wintertime, lots of these caracaras congregate in particular agricultural fields. There's an area called the Santa Cruz Flats where sometimes hundreds of these things show up in the wintertime and are foraging in these ag fields. And the question that was sort of driving that project was, who are these birds? Where do they come from? Are they young birds from local nesting territories? Are they coming north from Mexico? Where do they go in the summer? Because in the summer, they're not there. They're not in that agricultural area. Do they go to Mexico? Do they go to Texas? We don't know what happens to them or where they come from or who those birds are. So we started working there and found that aside from the landscape being obviously completely different from Florida, the birds are completely different. Their behaviors are different. Their responses are different. They're much more sensitive to humans than the birds in Florida. The birds in Florida see humans pretty much all the time, so they're used to activity and people and vehicles and driving and things like that. But in Arizona, that's not the case, and so their responses to us being there and trying to catch them and things, they're much more wary. It's much more challenging, and so far we've only been able to get one subadult bird with a transmitter, but it's been on the bird now for 3 years, over 3 years, and we have some really interesting data about its movements around Arizona. It's moving quite far, but it goes back and forth to the same places. It hasn't been to Texas, it hasn't been to Mexico, so it's becoming predictable in terms of how it interacts with the Arizona landscape. But a sample size of one doesn't really tell you much, so we need to catch more of these younger birds. I don't want to focus on nesting in Arizona at this time because the question really involves these younger birds that show up in the winter. So we have to figure out more about how we're going to catch those birds, and that's a little bit of a challenge. Again, interestingly, nobody has studied this bird anywhere except me. And so we don't really know anything about those island populations. We don't know how many there are, how well they're doing. The bird is somewhat common in certain parts of South America, although actually south of Venezuela and parts of Brazil, it's a different species, but it's very similar. And there are quite a few of them on farms and agricultural lands there. There was a PhD student who studied them in Argentina a few years ago. I don't believe she's published anything yet. I was actually in very southern Argentina back in 2011. We went down with a raptor colleague of mine who wanted to do some nesting work down there, and we did a little bit of work on some ranches. We found some cliff nests on the coast. We found some nests in pretty scrubby vegetation. In fact, the birds in Texas nest in pretty scrubby vegetation because that's a lot of what is there. So they can be quite different in terms of where they are nesting, but they still are very open habitat species. It's still grassland or ranch land or pastures or prairie, mostly very, very open. And then in the opportunity to find a suitable nesting substrate, like even a tiny bush, sometimes in Argentina there were 3 or 4 foot bushes where they were nesting, or on a very tall cell tower or gas flare tower. We found some nesting on places like that in Argentina where there were gas extraction facilities. They would be nesting on these towers. So in a very flat open landscape, they sort of pick any place they can find that was suitable to put a nest structure on. And yet, yes, we really don't know anything about the bird in other places. It's just not one that has attracted a lot of attention for studying. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe because they're common in some places. Maybe because they're sort of perceived to be aligned with scavengers because they do eat a lot of dead material, carrion, roadkill. And like vultures, they sort of have a bad rap for doing that. But they're very interesting. They're very smart. I think ecologically they're similar to ravens in terms of their social behavior, their communication, their very opportunistic, they're omnivores. And so it's interesting to me that, for example, in Florida, there are no ravens, but there are caracaras. And in South America, if you look at the distribution of corvids throughout South America, you have a few jays that are in Central America, northern South America, but otherwise there are no corvids in the southern part of the southern cone, and that's where caracaras as a group are dominant. There are 9 species, and they're existing in various different parts of South America, and I find that really interesting. But none of those species have been well studied, actually, which is really too bad. Yeah, well, I think a lot of the color that's on caracaras may be social signaling. Certainly their face color can vary from sort of a washed out pink to a bright yellow-orange. Whether or not they can control that is not clear. My PhD student, James Dwyer, a few years ago did a paper on that. I'm trying to understand the relationship between that face color and maybe being in a group or being near a piece of carrion and fighting with other birds or fighting with other vultures. Did that face color change, and how did that happen? The young birds are very pale for the first couple of years. They don't attain the full adult plumage with the black and white and the full face color and the yellow legs until they're about 3. So we still don't really understand the role of that face color, but usually colors like that on birds have some kind of social significance. Now, the other thing that's interesting is the yellow crop. And the yellow crop is as yellow as a lemon. It's really bright, and you see it when the bird has eaten a lot of food, and it really sticks out. And I often get questions from people who say, what is that tumor on the front of that bird? And they don't realize that it's a full crop. But being as yellow as it is, I think you're probably right that it's a signal of some kind. Hey, look at how good I am at finding food. I got a big full crop here, and it's bright yellow, and you can see it. And that may be a very effective social signal to a potential mate or to its own mate that, hey, I found a lot of good food over there that we can feed the kids. Let's go get some more, kind of thing. There's not a lot of dimorphism in this species. The females are slightly but not significantly larger than males. We do have some measurements that fit into an equation that will give us a probability of being female, but that equation is only accurate 75 to 80% of the time. So we take a blood sample from each bird we capture, and the genetics folks do the chromosome test to determine definitively whether it's male or female. And so I can guess, but I usually would rather not until we get the blood sample back. So when I was doing my graduate work, along with catching adults and getting home range information, we also radio tagged a whole lot of nestlings and recent fledglings to find out what happened to them after they left the nest. And we tracked them again by airplane and by being on the ground. And they were all over the place. They spent about 2 months really close to the nest still what I call the post-fledgling dependency period, which is when they were still pretty dependent on their parents. They stayed around the nest. They were often fed by the parents. They begged to their parents. After about a month, they could pretty much feed themselves and were encouraged to do so by the parents that would sometimes just listen to them scream and not do anything. But after 2 months, they began to explore a little bit more around the territory, and they'd make these little excursions out of the territory and back. And then at some point, anywhere from 3 months to 11 months after fledging, there was a very distinct period when they just left. And we tracked them by air. For 3 years, we tracked birds by air every week. So we knew exactly when that period of time was, when they just left. And when they left, they went far. So it's a very clear delineation from week to week of those locations, and all of a sudden, boom, they were way over here. So there was a very definitely defined dispersal time. And after that, they wandered around the range quite extensively. Sometimes they would come back closer to the nest, but then they would wander some more. And then James Dwyer, my PhD student, picked up after that period and tracked those birds over a couple of years. So where did they go when they were still not breeders? They were going all over the range. They were roosting in various different places. He identified a whole bunch of communal roosts where the birds would go, and they would go back and forth among these roosts. And also tracked them around the range foraging in many, many places, and sort of put out the hypothesis that maybe during that time period the birds were prospecting, not only looking for good foraging places and following each other perhaps to food, but getting the lay of the land, as it were, and maybe learning where the territories were, where there might be a territorial opening at some point where they could slip in and become breeder. They might be seeking suitable mates during that period. But in a population that is essentially closed and operating with limited habitat, you could imagine that may be what the birds are doing, is really trying to find a place where they could slip in and become a breeder, because there weren't too many opportunities. We know from our data that the birds stay on their territories for a long time, maybe as long as they live. And so maybe openings don't come up very often. And we also know that there were birds with breeding plumage in the groups that were traveling around being sort of nomadic, which suggests that there are birds out there capable of breeding that can't find a spot. So again, that's another part of their life history that we don't understand well, how they recruit into the breeding population and how successful they are at doing that. These birds continue to surprise me as I've studied them over the years. I can't expect that I ever understand everything about what they do, because we found so many instances when we were surprised. And the first one was double brooding. We did not expect them to have more than one brood every year, because most raptors don't do that, certainly not big raptors. There's not enough time during a well-defined breeding season to have 2 successful nests. But it turns out in Florida there is enough time, and the birds that nest early in the season, which means they could start their first nest as early as September, October, have sufficient time to have a second one, starting in maybe February or March or even April. And some birds, quite a few birds actually do that, and some of those birds are successful. And so that was a big surprise. Oh, and the other thing that would not surprise me at this point is some form of cooperative breeding, or at least tolerant of other birds in their territories. Now, I've already said that they don't tolerate other adults in their nesting territory. However, we have seen in some instances, quite a few, a young bird that is not a fledgling, that would be considered a subadult by plumage, in a nesting territory or even in trees close to a nest, that the adults don't do anything to. They don't attack it, they don't chase it off. Now, sometimes they do chase it off, but I've seen instances when they don't, and I'm wondering whether those might be their young from a previous year come back to the territory, and they know who it is, so they tolerate it. I'm just not sure. But cooperative breeding, Harris's hawks, I believe, do some cooperative breeding. Some other raptors do to some degree, but not as much as scrub jays, perhaps. But I guess I wouldn't be surprised if someday that was documented. I actually have daily files from my dissertation period. Every day I wrote in a journal on the computer, and I still have those files. And going back and reading them is pretty interesting.
Oh, I bet.
Especially at the time when we had so many questions. We didn't know what was going on, and we were making notes about, what am I looking at today, or whatever. Yeah, that was kind of interesting. Oh, I remember getting into birds when I was really young. We lived in a house that had a nice big willow tree in the back, and we put up a bird feeder. I think it was probably 10 or 11. And we put up a bird feeder, and all these birds started coming. And my dad gave me a Peterson field guide, probably one of the first editions of that book at the time. And we started to learn the birds that were coming to the feeder. And I don't know, it just seems to be something that I always sort of did. And then he taught me how to use tools, and we built bird houses. And I remember one time getting in big trouble for attempting to sharpen our crosscut saw on our wheel, the diamond wheel. Crosscut saw's teeth go like this. So when you sharpen them, you screw it up. So I was doing that, thinking I was doing something good, but I didn't know better. So things like that. But we built bird houses, and we built bird feeders, and we had field guides, and it was just something that I was always interested in, was doing birds. And yet I spent some time in New Mexico working with small mammals, and did my master's degree on geese. So I'm not sure when I became a serious birder, although I'm not really a birder. I love birds and I love to watch them, but I don't keep lists and counts and those kind of things. But I got the raptor bug in the mid-'80s when I was working for a woman who became a mentor, who was doing her own dissertation work on goshawks and Cooper's hawks, and she hired me to be a field guide at that point. And so I learned how to do some capturing and handling, and got interested in the whole raptor thing, and joined the Raptor Research Foundation, which is our professional society that's just a tremendous group of people working on so difficult species and difficult conditions and all around the world. And so I'm really happy to have found that group and feel that we all really share love of raptors, but interesting questions too, in trying to understand birds of prey as top predators in a continually changing and human impacted world, where top predators often suffer the most from human activities. So that's part of why I think my project is important too, not just scientifically, but using caracaras as sort of a link to getting the public excited about birds in Florida, raptors in Florida, the value of some human activities to those species. For the caracara particularly, it's cattle ranches, and where we ended up finding most of the caracara nests was on active cattle ranches, and the locations of the birds were often in pastures that had cattle. And so the caracaras really like what these ranchers are doing. They like the cattle, they like the pastures, they like the low grass because they can walk around and find prey. They walk a lot, they don't stoop and catch things with their feet like most raptors. They like the burning because it turns up dead things for them to eat. They like the plowing for the same reason. So they're really pretty compatible with a lot of the activities that go on cattle ranches. And I was very happy to find that out and to publish it and to be able to have a very good relationship with the Florida Cattlemen's Association and a lot of the ranchers in the area. And it saddens me to see a lot of those habitats now being converted again to housing or sugarcane or something that caracaras don't like so much. But caracaras are very beautiful. They're interesting, they're smart, they're good education birds, and so it's a kind of a good way to make a link between all those issues of wildlife and human environments with the general public. So I spent a lot of my time doing that with articles and talks. I gave a lot of talks to Audubon groups, I still do, and writing public type articles, not just scientific articles, and trying to get people excited about the bird and those kinds of issues.
Is there, one thing you wish everybody knew about caracara? Or is there any kind of main point that you try to get across in all of those?
Just that there are human activities that can be compatible with the persistence of wildlife populations, and we need to uncover those and work with landowners, work with economists. I understand that lands have to provide some economic benefit to find out what those activities are and to try to focus on them so we can have some kind of coexistence between humans and all the native wildlife that everybody in Florida loves so much and hopes to protect.
If you could go back and talk to Joan on her first day at Buck Island, what advice would you want to give yourself?
Oh my God. Don't give up, but also don't sit anywhere on the pavement where fire ants might come because they will bite you. I did that. Early on, I was working on a trap or something, and I had on shorts and flip-flops, and I'm sitting on this cement walkway over there, not paying attention, and I squished one. And when you squished one, all their brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and everybody else comes over to figure out who did the squishing. And boy, I suffered for that one. Well, when I was growing up, I certainly never expected to be doing something like this. Even as I went through my teens and 20s and early 30s, I never expected to be doing anything like this. But the opportunity came along, and you have to follow your passion. You have to take chances and go after challenges. And it will not only be interesting and exciting, but it will help you develop your self-confidence and your knowledge that you can make a contribution and you can learn something really cool and have a good time doing it, make a lot of new friends, and do something good for the world and for wildlife.
What's the hardest part of working with caracara, or just working in the field, the wildlife biology field?
You really learn patience, because you can't wait for something to happen, and something doesn't always happen. You just have to be patient. And if you're watching a nest, you may have to sit there and watch for several hours. Or if you're waiting on a trap and wanting the birds to come in, you may have to wait for several hours. And so working with wildlife, working with any kind of species that isn't humans are so, at this point, focused, not really even focused, but just things happen so quickly, and the expectations of turnover of flashes on TV. Working in nature and working with wildlife is not like that. You learn patience, and you learn to observe, and you learn to just take a breath and slow down a little bit, and sometimes that really makes your life a lot better, because otherwise it's just too crazy with all the modern stuff that comes at us every day. So it's so relaxing and helpful to be out in this kind of environment, just sitting for hours and waiting for a nest, watching a nest, waiting for something to happen. And when it happens, it's like Christmas. It's the best thing ever.